Okay, today we're going to continue on in the book of Mark, chapter 5, and we're going to look at these two parallel healings in verses 21 to 43. Now, before you continue watching this video, especially if you're doing this with a small group, I encourage you to go and read that section, and you'll find that Jesus is coming from healing the demoniac, which we looked at last week, and he's approached by this guy named Jairus, who has a daughter who's sick. And while he's on the way to deal with that situation, another woman comes up to him in the crowd who's had this issue of bleeding, and she touches him to get healed. And today I want to show you 5 parallels between these two healings that you may not have noticed, but the author, Mark, wants to make sure that you pay attention to it. Now, the first parallel is that in both situations, there was desperation. Verse 22, when the father saw Jesus, he fell at his feet, pleading fervently with him. My little daughter is dying, he said. Please come and lay your hands on her, heal her so she can live. Now, the text says that Jairus was a synagogue ruler, which means that he was a lay person, not a priest, but a lay person who had administrative duties in the synagogue. And we've already seen in the Gospel of Mark that at this point, Jesus was not really particularly a fan favorite when it came to the religious class. But this father obviously didn't care about that. He was desperate for a healing, and he knew that Jesus could do something about it. Now, the woman, it says in verse 26, had suffered a great deal from many doctors, and over the years, she had spent everything she had to pay them, but she'd gotten no better. In fact, she'd only gotten worse. So this woman was certainly never married, or if she had been, she was probably divorced because of her condition. The impact wasn't just physical, it was financial, it was social, and it was even spiritual, as we're going to see here in a little bit. So she was desperate enough to enter the crowd and break the rules to seek a healing from Jesus. Now, the next parallel has to do with the number 12. It says in verse 42 that the girl was 12 years old. But did you notice that it says in verse 25 that the woman in the crowd had suffered for 12 years with this issue of bleeding? Now, the number 12 is one of those important numbers in the Bible. There were 12 tribes of Israel in the Old Testament. There were 12 disciples in the New Testament. So to the Jew, the number 12 symbolized restoration, and it symbolized covenant relationship with God. So keep that in mind as you continue to read about these important healings. The next parallel in the story has to do with the word daughters. Obviously, the father said, my little daughter is dying. But did you notice that in verse 34 that Jesus said to the woman, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace, your suffering is over. It's important to remember as we read this today that 2,000 years ago, women were sort of second-class citizens. So it really was a countercultural thing for Jesus to focus on women, or even for Mark to include these healings together in this passage. But Mark wanted us to understand the heart of God for women. The fourth parallel is really powerful, and it might be hard for us to understand if we're not Jewish. In verse 41, it says that holding the little daughter's hand, Jesus said to her, Talitha cum, which means little girl, get up. Now, you might not think very much about this verse unless you knew this, Numbers 19 from the Old Testament. It says there that anyone who touches a dead human body will be ceremonially unclean for 7 days. So Jesus literally was ritually unclean because he touched a dead body, but he didn't care. And we've seen this before, even in the Gospel of Mark. Jesus is greater than the legalistic ceremonial rules. And what about the woman? Verse 27 and 28, it says that she came up behind Jesus through the crowd and touched his robe because she thought to herself, if I can just touch his robe, I'll be healed. But did you realize that Leviticus 15:27 says that anything that a woman like this would touch would be ceremonially unclean? And so the person who came into contact with a woman like this, who had an issue like she had to wash their clothes and bathe themselves in water, and that person would remain unclean until evening. This, by the way, is the reason that Jesus turned around and called her out in the crowd. He said, who touched me? I know that some power went out from me. And he didn't do that to embarrass the woman. It was actually the exact opposite. He did it because he wanted everyone to know that she had been healed. So it wasn't just the physical healing that he wanted her to have, but it was also the social healing. And all of this leads to the fifth parallel between these two stories of healing, and it's all about faith. Verse 23, the father said, my little daughter is dying. Please come and lay your hands on her, heal her so she can live. Notice that this synagogue ruler had faith in the healing power of Jesus, just as the woman did. In verse 28, she thought to herself, if I can just touch his robe, I'll be healed. And later on, verse 34, Jesus said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Your suffering is over. In both stories, and in fact, in every healing that we see in the Gospel of Mark or any of the Gospels, these two ingredients are so critical. They're so important. Number one, we need to have faith. And number two, the object of our faith is Jesus. And that wasn't just true back in Jesus's day. It remains true for all of us who are following Jesus today.